We now have come to look at the Enneagram model. I suspect that's what you opened up this video to see and explore, and now the time is here. And before we really get into the 9 types, it's important that we explore how the Enneagram is understanding types. This is a part of that foundational root system that will make sense of the 9 types when we get there. So I like to think of our types as similar to nationalities. So if you were born in the United States, you have a certain context for seeing the world, seeing your life. You have certain meanings of words, certain foods, certain familiar places and people that inform who you are. And yet, growing up in the United States does not mean we all end up thinking and acting the same. We are very different, and yet we are similar and the same. And similarly, somebody born in Scandinavia or the Far East or Africa, they're going to have some very different ways of seeing the world than people in the United States. They're going to have some commonalities that shape who they are. And yet, of course, they're very different from one another, no matter what country they're raised in. So as we look at the types of the Enneagram, it's important to realize that within any type, there are similarities, but there are also differences. Not everything in a type is going to apply to you. Now, one of the most common questions that gets asked about types is, are we born with it? Or is it something we develop through our lives? The Enneagram theory, most people believe, is that we are born with a type. It's like that blueprint that gets encoded within the acorn. That type is a part of how we filter the world, how we move through the world. And it doesn't change throughout our lifetime. What does change is how attached we are to that type. And as we move up the awareness V, as we develop as human beings, in a strange way, we actually become less of our type and more free to be different kinds of types. So one of the resistance points to the Enneagram that I've heard so many times is, I don't like the Enneagram because it puts us into a box. It labels me as one of 9 types. And actually, that's a misreading of what the Enneagram is about. The Enneagram's whole point is to get us out of the box of our type and into this freedom, into this butterfly state, where we can be any of the 9 types. Now, people also will ask, as we look at that globe picture, about demographics. They'll ask about, well, is this just a United States thing, or is this true in other cultures? There's not a lot of statistics about demographics in the Enneagram, and in part it's because the Enneagram is such a difficult thing to measure and to capture. But the Enneagram is really taking off throughout this globe. There are Enneagram groups that are formed on every continent. There's a lot of international activity around the Enneagram. And actually, the Enneagram Association is called the International Enneagram Association. And it really is taking off like wildfire throughout our globe. And that is because it does explain how we get stuck and how we are different across cultures. Another significant factor with the Enneagram is that people can very easily mistype themselves. I thought I was a certain type for about 6 months and then came into a new awareness that really wasn't me. So mistyping ourselves is a very common thing, and it's one of the reasons why we really can't get good demographic information, because people, they may type themselves, but they may be mistyping themselves. So the Enneagram is difficult to type because it is dealing at that level of motivation. And it takes some real personal work to get down to that level of motivation and understand it. There are also certain complexities that make it challenging to type ourselves. There are things called look-alike types, where two types of the Enneagram will have some real overlaps, but some significant differences. There are things called wings that I'll be talking about later, types that are on either side of a particular type. So if you're a type 4, you might have a type 5 wing, or you might have a type 3 wing. And those can sometimes be confusing around what our type is. And then there's this whole dimension of the Enneagram that's called subtypes that I'm not going to go into detail there, but it's another one of those aspects that can make our types confusing. So there are many layers of complexity with typing ourselves that are both psychological and cultural.